This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties, and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove, wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness. One should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Anatta, the big one. One of the things is we don't talk about it so much, but it's really at the heart of Buddhism and everything else. Anatta, non-self, as it's often translated. But it's a deep one. And some of the things we don't talk about often is how it connects together as far as the Buddha used it from a more historical point of view. The way he used it was not only as an objective reality, but as a philosophical device to relate to how all the other teachings that were around at the time. And that actually makes things a lot easier to understand when we bring those into the picture. Because when we look at the earliest sort of development of Indian philosophy from the Vedas, the idea of the self, the Atman or the Atta in Pali, really isn't mentioned that much. It's not even really an issue. The Vedas are a collection of hymns and sacrifices and, wishes to the gods for a good harvest, for a good season, to send us heroes and to crush our enemies and all that sort of thing. There's very little philosophy in it. Fast forward though, and a big shift came in, the Upanishads. Now these weren't written until much later, as in, like the Buddhist texts, they weren't put in print until much later, but they were circulating around during the time of the Buddha. And these are things he interacted with. And here it gets very, very interesting, because these early ideas, these are the source of ideas like karma and samsara and nirvana and all these other ideas started to formulate around then. And yet their approach to them, their understanding, was very, very different to what the Buddha taught. And that was a big, big shift of what the Buddha introduced here. Because the idea of the Atman, or the self, the soul, the entity, all these words for an absolute selfhood is a very, very big thing. There's a text in one of the principal Upanishads, and it's called the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Great Forest Upanishad. And in it, it postulates that the self, the soul, the entity, the Atman, consumes nothing and nothing consumes it. In other words, it's entirely non-relative. It exists fully independent. It needs nothing and nothing will damage it. It's completely separate from the rest of the universe. And the belief was, if you can find that Atman, that self, you will find your enlightenment, your liberation, your oneness with the universe. You will be free from all suffering. And this was a big thing everyone was looking for. And of course, there are lots of different approaches to find it. You know, the ascetic path or the philosophical path, all these different means and ways that the different traditions were following and trying and experimenting with. None of them were really working. And this is right at the center of what the Buddha's story, of all the trials that he went through, were to find this Atman, this self, the soul, to be free. And he never found it. And that was the big thing. He kept trying to find it, kept trying all these different things, trying to punish the body, to make it submit to the will, so it wouldn't, to liberate the soul, so to speak. And these ideas are still around in modern religions. And that's a very, very big thing to look at. So when we look at what they were looking for in the Upanishads, is another interesting thing. They were looking for the end of death. So what they were looking for was basically to go to heaven and for it to last forever. They had already accepted that heaven itself was impermanent. Samsara kept on moving. Born here, dying there, born again, dying again, born again, dying again. Their goal was to end the dying process. And yet what the Buddha discovered was very, very different. That the cause was not death, but being born in the first place. And if you continue this existence cycle, it is inevitable that it will come to an end. Because everything is still impermanent. Everything is still anicca, unreliable, uncertain, changing. And that is the central problem. But when we look into it, so as the Buddha says, the problem is rebirth. How do we end rebirth? It's a very different question to how do we end death. And what is the self and the soul in this question? Because this entire world postulates on this idea of me, mine, what I am. And yet, when we look at it, there's a problem with this. Because the self, the soul, according to the Upanishads being non-relative, is eternal, it's blissful, it's real, it's true. And this philosophy exists today. It's what's called Satchitananda in modern Hinduism. And it's a very important school of thought. And the Buddha basically sort of says, it's not blissful, it's dukkha, it is suffering, it's unsatisfactory, it's all those things. It's not eternal, it's impermanent, it's relative. And it is not truly something to be called a self. And it gets more interesting the more we look into it. Because the thing that's really interesting compared to early Buddhism, to modern Buddhism, is their sense of time. They were able to look at time in a very different way that we do. Today, particularly in Western Buddhism, there's this thing of just be in the present moment kind of thing, which is an incredibly narrow, small little world when you think about it. Whereas they were looking at much, much bigger scopes of time because they were looking at samsara. They were looking at rebirth after rebirth after rebirth, eon after eon, world system after world system. Because the thing is, the vastness of time shows the difference in here. The Buddha says samsara is without a beginning and it's without an end. And that's a big, big sort of wake up, so to speak, compared to these other thoughts, because it's very centering. The thing is, when we treat rebirth as a thought experiment, I'm an Australian, so to speak, from Kalamunda. I have light skin, I have blue eyes, I have brown hair if it grows. I speak English with a certain accent. I have these qualities, these characteristics, all these different things. And yet, from a rebirth point of view, that's only what I am at the moment. All of us have been light-skinned, dark-skinned, male, female, young, old, rich, poor, healthy, unhealthy, intelligent, unintelligent. We've been good people, we've been bad people. None of these has been consistent or constant through any of these. And yet, when we look at it in the world, what are the things that we take the most seriously? Our skin colour, our eye colour, our gender, our sexuality, our language, our religion, our political ideologies, our governments and all these things, that's only as they are at the moment. They don't actually have any absolute reality in themselves. They haven't been there eternal. They don't exist non-relatively, as in it consumes nothing. Because that's the thing. This beautiful idea of the Upanishads was what everyone was looking for. We've talked before about the pots of gold at the end of the rainbow. Well, this is the ultimate pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. An eternal self, completely free from everything else, completely in my control, following my will and desires, eternal and free. And that's what everyone was looking for. And yet all the prejudices in the world are tied to this idea of what I am compared to what you are. Because I relate to somebody else, as everybody else does. We relate to each other according to what the other person is. So we're measuring compared to the other person. We have these things in common, so we can be friends. We have these things different, therefore you're the enemy, right? There's a separation constantly going on to define ourselves. And we're trying to define ourselves because this internal self is not there. So many people around the world are trying to find themselves. This great big going to, all these spiritual quests and everything else and all that to find ourselves. Well, if our self was true and real, we would never have to do that in the first place. And so this absence correlates to the need to search for it, which is a big, big difference. And yet there's so much more that can be worked through this thought experiment. That just because this is how I am at the moment, doesn't mean this is how I will always be. So even if we're in happy circumstances or miserable circumstances, we're not trapped in a miserable circumstance. We can change. And that's the thing. There's a lot of freedom that comes in from being able to change. Because when we look at time again, if we were to imagine the universe, it's been around 14.6 billion years or something like that, around that number. If we were to consider the entire length of the universe in a single day, then when we look at it, the dinosaurs have only been around for about half an hour. Human beings have been around for less than a couple of minutes. Our life doesn't even count for a second. It changes so quickly. And yet this universe has been around 14.6 billion years. And these things that we take so seriously, that we're prepared to kill over, wage war over, all kinds of monstrosities and atrocities in the world, are based on something that we consider to be me and mine and what I am, compared to you and yours and what you are. The us, the them, all these different things. How we try to get a grip on the world, right? We're all trying to do this because the world is chaotic. It is impermanent. Everything is changing. And we're trying to get a grip on it, to survive. The ideal is to be happy, but at least, to avoid some suffering. That's what we're all trying to do. And yet, taking these things so seriously, when they're always going to slip through our fingers, is only going to make things far, far worse. Trying to own them and control them. We all know deep down that it's not going to last. And yet we still do it. Because we believe it. We construct a story and we believe it. And this is the problem. Only the ego thinks it's a prisoner of samsara. And yet when we practice these beautiful selfless qualities, see, that's the thing. We talked about this before. Why are all the most beautiful human qualities called selfless in the English language? Because they are. And yet when we're pursuing the self-centered view, trying to solidify this idea of a self, all horrors that we do over an idea. Crazy. And yet we do it because we believe it. And we believe it because we haven't seen better. We haven't had anything else. And so when we go further into this, to look at all In modern terms, we can talk about our DNA, which of course they didn't talk about during the Buddhist time because they didn't have the technology to look at this stuff. How much of our DNA has anything to do with being human? Very, very little. How much of our microbiome, which is another new thing, or at least we've been talking about it for 30 years, but relatively new, very little of that is to do with being human, how it operates inside of us and everything else. And the way the Buddha relates to the world makes it more fascinating, because the Buddha talks about everything in terms of the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates in English. And they are, the rupa khandha is the first one, which relates to all the solids, liquids, gases and energy in the universe, which is a little bit difficult for, Western Buddhists who like to talk about physical sciences in that way. The Buddha lumps all the physics just under one category, so it's a little difficult to talk about because we're used to quantifying it in lots of different ways, and it can be quantified, it just comes under one big umbrella term, the rupa khandha, form or material. So all the solids, liquids, gases and energy in the universe, and they're all impermanent, they're all changing. And yet none of them have been created and none of them have been destroyed. They're constantly changing. The atoms that make us up have been used billions of times before, and they'll be used billions of times after we're finished with them. That's what happens. It's all just change. It's no problem. And then we look further, the experiences, the Vedana khandha. All those are dependent relative on something else. They're impermanent, they change. We don't really have control over it. And it goes on. The sanya khandha, which is our perception, our analysis, our thoughts, our memories, all that world of how we identify and perception is usually what it's called, but it's more the sense of getting a grip of it. Then what we do with it, which is a sankhara, the will, the agendas, this is what it is, I experience this is my determination of it, this is what I can do with it. Then the sense consciousness. And here's where it gets interesting again. We're used to dealing with consciousness in a singular term. We talk about the ego in the singular. We talk about the self, the soul, in the singular, as if it's one thing. Whereas the Buddha is saying, there are many things working together. There's no singularity in this. And that's a big, big thing to look into. Because we often in the West talk about mind, body and spirit in a sort of a threefold system compared to the fivefold system that the Buddha used. And if we look at the threefold system, well, we can tell the body is not us because it ages. It grows old. It gets sick. It dies. We're not the same as we were as little babies. None of those cells are in us now. The cells in our body only has a couple of year lifespan, and they change. But when we look at it, what is the mind? And what is the spirit? Well, most of the things that we call spirit really are mind. There's no difference between them, really. And when we look at the mind and body, how they interact, it starts to get really fuzzy to try and determine any of these as actual things, separate, non-relative. They're all just processes. They're all just things that have accumulated. And that's okay. So the problem with anatta is that it can start to sound a bit demoralizing. It can sort of even sound a bit morbid as a way. Most people try to run away from it. They like to talk about it, being profound, but when it comes to the experience of it, most people are going, ooh, because it feels like, well, I'm doing all this. I'm looking for this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. What is life worth then? And of course, that's really the wrong question from a Buddhist point of view. It's more, how can we make life meaningful? How can we make life better quality? This is what we have now. What's the best we can do with it in relation to ourselves and each other? And that's a very, very different question. So when it comes to anatta, there's a lot in it which is very, very interesting. Because when everybody around the Buddha was trying to liberate this self, if there's no self there, there's no need to liberate it. There's no need to punish yourself with asceticism or trying all these different things, driving yourself crazy to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow when there isn't one, and when the rainbow was just a trick of the light. It's very, very liberating in that way. Ajahn Chah was once asked, what have you gained from all this meditation? And he famously replied that he gained nothing. But he then said, but look at all the things I've lost. All the disappointment, the frustrations, the anger, all these runarounds, all these things. What we lose in that sense was tied to this sense of me and mine and my happiness and, what I will do to get my happiness, right? And all that kind of ego trippery. So it's very, very liberating to be able to consider it. And it's very, very important in the Buddhist practice to do that. That's, the Buddha himself said, we should be mindful almost constantly, to be mindful of the impermanence, the anatta, the dukkha. So we can constantly compare this and say, this is how it is. And we don't have to worry so much about it. That's very liberating. And that gives us a lot of happiness. But it's all about how we see it in the world. If we're still tied in this paradigm, because not everybody's ready for this kind of thing. Not everybody's ready to do anatta. And that's fine. But when we look at it and sort of say, if we want to stay in the samsara, we want to stay as we are, then we really have a choice between improving our life or carrying on as we are. And that really raises the question, what is the most rational thing to do in that situation? Well, it's to do as good as you can, to live with integrity, to do good, to be generous, to make your life more meaningful and better quality. Right? In other words, to do good karma and everything else, because that lifts you up, that fills your life with good memories. It makes you feel more at ease and relaxed, and the feeling that you haven't wasted your life, that you've done good with it, regardless of how rotten the situation can be, and it can be pretty damn rotten. Life is hard, but we did good with it. That matters. We did our best. That really matters too, because we look inside ourselves. We have to relate to ourselves, speaking conventionally, but with this body and with this mind. We experience this. We experience everyday life. And how we feel inside ourselves, our relationship with ourselves, will define how we live in the world. Because the Buddha himself says, you can tell where a person is going in the future according to how they're developing their mind now. Are they developing it towards good, wholesome states, or are they developing negative, bitter, angry, violent, destructive states? Because if that's what they're cultivating now, that's the direction that they'll be moving towards. Because that's the soil, you could say, the foundation that they will be making for their future. And so this understanding gives us so many options, so many choices. In a positive way, having too many choices can be a big burden. But it gives us that sense that we don't have to be stuck with our misery. We can let it go. And that's the joy of this, is seeing that we can let this go because it was always impermanent. It was always going to fall away. And this is one of these things in Buddhism called dependent arising and dependent cessation. And this is one of the weird and fascinating things the Buddha realized, is that we relate to the problem of life, that it's impermanent, that it's unreliable, that it's out of control, and it sucks. And that's profoundly unpleasant. And even the best experiences, the lovely experiences, are going to change on us. They're still going to go away. And even the yummy things in life, having lots of things we like to eat, well, if you eat too much of them, you're going to get a tummy ache, and eventually it will make you sick. So all these, and so on and so on and so on, all of a sudden, these become the solution. It was always impermanent, so it was always going to fade away. All the traumas inside ourselves were going to fade away if we let them. And the mind was always going to let them. The body was always trying to let go. And yet we're trying to hold on, we're trying to solidify and keep everything together. We've mentioned before,
we look at the world, we see the chaos, and we build up these firewalls, this fortress, this way to protect ourselves from the rest of the world and everything else. We instantly look at everybody else and sort of say, yes, that's my friend, that's my enemy. That's a threat. Deal with it, attack it, get rid of it, destroy it, kill it. How we relate to the world is based on that fundamental problem. But when we change our view and we see that this self, this Atman, or Atta in Pali, was just an idea, and how much trouble it causes, compared to this paradigm shift that we talked about last week of experiencing what it's like outside of this self idea. What is it like outside the fortress? To step outside under the open sky, to have the fresh air. What is it like? What is it like to experience these beautiful selfless qualities? Do they make your life better or do they make it worse? And we gradually shift from experience. Because once we see all these beautiful qualities and we know how to find them inside ourselves, you don't need anybody to give you the kindness, the compassion, the joy, the happiness, the ease, the comfort, all the things we're looking for, because they're already inside of us. They're already inside our mind. They're our potential, so to speak. It's just for us to be able to allow them to come, allow them to be. Dominant is really the wrong word, but the main paradigm, you could say. So instead of looking at saying, okay, well, we have this option or this option, this is what we started with, and it's not very nice, but there's these options, and we try this and it makes life better. What's the rational thing to do? Choose the better one. And that's the thing. It's a matter of self-respect, so to say, to choose the better option. But the thing is, a lot of people say, this is very easy to talk about. You're a monastic, you're living in a safe place. We've got to work, and we've got all these cost of living crisis, and we've got families and all these other things. Yes, very true. They are things that are going to consume your time and your life. Absolutely. And that's okay. We still do our best in the situation we have. I don't, for one, buy into the idea that no one can practice living at home, that you can only practice being a monastic. I've met plenty of monastics who don't practice at all. It's not a guarantee that the monastic life is necessarily better, but it does offer the better conditions. So it's up for us to take advantage of those. Ajahn Chah had a very interesting way of putting it. He described a monastic, he said, if you're a real practitioner and you go to a monastery, what a practitioner is going to do is practice. They're going to make the best of the circumstances and automatically take advantage of them, where a non-practitioner won't. So he sort of said, if you put a cow in a field, it's going to eat the grass, it's going to graze. If an animal is in the field and it's not grazing, well, maybe it's not a cow, maybe it's a pig. I think he was a little bit cheeky on that one, but it's quite I kind of like it. It's a bit subtle. But, this is the thing. It's all about looking at our life and sort of saying, what is the best we can do with what we have? And it doesn't matter what we have. Because ultimately, everything is impermanent. Everything changes. We can choose and act to change our life and to help others change their lives. And as I said before, last week, sometimes just being with another person who is a practitioner, you feel it automatically. They don't even have to be a Buddhist or anything else. Just a person who is naturally kind, naturally looking for developing those good qualities in their life. You feel it just being with them. And, this isn't something we need to communicate. There's just this sense automatically that this is a person who's not out, to get what they can and to exploit and to follow their agenda and to do that whole, narcissistic game. This is a person who's just comfortable being who they are, who's completely at ease in their present moment because they don't need anything else. They don't need to run off into the future. afraid of what's going to happen, or the fear of missing out, or trying to get this and trying to get that, and so on and so on and so on. And I don't have to worry about the past. This past that is so long, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. We don't have to worry about it. That's the big, big difference between modern Buddhism, so to speak, and early Buddhism. Early Buddhism, because they had this big sense of time, that's all gone. It doesn't matter how we got here. We are here. Yes, it's all cause and effect. Yes, it's all dependent origination and everything else. But this is where we are now. We don't have to worry about the things we did in the past that landed us in such and such an unpleasant situation. We don't have to worry about that. We look at this is where we are now, but where we're moving into the future. Modern people like to, unfortunately, obsess a lot about their past and all the things that have happened to them and all the wrongs that they did, all the traumas that they've, and tragedies that they've experienced. And they judge themselves and create a new story. And that story can be a bit monstrous, a horrible way to live. Because this fortress that we build up, the most solid building blocks of our fortress, of our identity, the Sakaya Ditti, as it's called in Pali, is suffering, is trauma, is the miseries, is the injustice. These make some of the best building blocks of our ego. So our ego relishes them, is looking for them, is gathering them all up to spin a story of how I'm the victim and all this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, it makes a prison. And we have to live in a prison built up of all these miseries. And we don't have to live that way. So much opportunity to develop joy and happiness and freedom by understanding anatta in the sense that nothing is non-relative, nothing is independent. And that's very, very freeing, because it's not our fault, it's not our failing to control the universe. We were never separate from the universe. That's the thing, we were never separate from it, so we don't have to worry about it. And that really eases the fear of death, the fear of old age, what's going to happen to us. We just return to the universe, that's all. Nothing lost, nothing gained. And there's a lot of freedom in that. So, been talking for about half an hour. Shall we get to the meditation? Okay. As everybody, please take a minute to adjust your seat. You can stand up and give yourself a bit of a stretch and do everything that you need to do. So we can settle in and make ourselves more comfy. Okay. And once we're in, you can close your eyes. And try to get a sense of the vastness of the space in the mind, the openness. So much of our time we live constrained and constricted, and now is the time we can relax. Now is the time we can let all this open up, to let all this go, and that it's okay. Spend this time with your body, relaxing it, making it more comfortable, adjusting it how you need it. And imagine breathing with your whole body, as if the air fills every part of your body, into the arms and legs, into the tummy. See if you can feel how the breath changes the feeling of the body. In this way, it can be quite easy to find the blockages or the tension or the tightness. And you can move to relax those, to make them more comfortable. With every breath you breathe in, imagine breathing in joy. And as you breathe out to relax. to breathe out the tension, the troubles, to celebrate the relief. It doesn't matter how you do it, but choose the format you like best. To really use the breath to help your meditation. For if we love what we're doing, we don't need to run away. We don't need to hide in thought and fantasies and worries. And now imagine the vastness of the sky, all the air in the sky around us. For every breath that we breathe in, all the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, the nitrogen, all that air and gases that go into our lungs, absorbed into our blood and into our cells, don't they come from the air around us? And as we breathe it out, doesn't it return to the air around us? When we imagine all the water in the lakes and the rivers and the ocean, and how it evaporates off the ocean and these rivers into the sky, and condenses and rains down again, or falls as snow, or tropical storms. And that water that we drink, doesn't it come from these rivers and these oceans? Doesn't it fill our whole body? And when it passes through us, doesn't it return to the sky in our breath? Or doesn't it leave us and return to the ocean eventually in the cycle? Where is the separateness? And imagine the heat in the air around us, or in fire, or even the cold, the lack of heat. Is that no different from the heat in our body? And consider the earth, the solids, all the things that make us up, the calcium, all the elements, the potassium, the iron, the magnesium. Don't we get all these things through our food? Don't these things come from the earth? And don't they return to the earth at the end? Where is the separateness? Does it really exist? But when we realize there's no separateness between us and the rest of the universe, isn't it possible to have kindness for everything within the universe? To have compassion for all that suffers. To have joy and to have acceptance for everything in it. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. And welcome back.
Our most pleasant meditation. I guess it's questions, is it?
Yes, please. What to say?
Okay, everyone, if anyone would like to ask a question, either in the chat or to speak and ask people directly, that would be helpful.
Joining or? Oh, yeah. This question.
Okay, certainly, please.
We need to meditate now.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
Yeah, you just came home. Yeah. The discussion was really good today. But this month, it was really.
I'm not sure whether that was a question or not. I think it was a personal discussion there, Venerable. Eva, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable, for your thoughts there. That was always very helpful. And I've been thinking about this question for a while, and because you brought the topic up, it really fits what I've been thinking about. So you talked a little bit about the self, and that it doesn't really exist as such. And what I don't understand is, so when you're then looking at rebirth, how does that work when there's no self, and you don't as self, you don't stay intact as such, but how can you then be reborn again and again and again? What is the part of you that kind of, is being reborn, or how can you then identify as being somebody who's being reborn again and again? So that part I don't understand. How does that work?
It's a good question. The system as such is basically a long stream of cause and effect. So there's this build-up, this momentum that arises because this desire to be, this desire to exist, this desire to be in such and such a form, or not to be in such and such a form, or we have this longing to achieve something, to have something. This desire continues on. And the thing is that it forms much like a dream state. So when we dream, so to speak, the body is pretty much completely out of touch. It's switched off, basically. And yet within that dream space, it continues on. But the thing that motivates and controls it is this underlying agenda, this underlying need for happiness, or to avoid suffering, to exist. All these desires and wants and everything else is the mechanism, that this force of energy, this attraction that keeps on going. The thing is that because it constantly changes, it takes form to exist in a rebirth sense. So how it appears in the next life is entirely relative according to the conditions that we want, of what we're used to, of what we desire for. But at the same time, it's also conditioned by our own sense of self, so to speak. So it's belief that I did this, I did that, I need to be punished for this, I did all these wrongs, etc., etc., etc. In other words, karma shapes our mind. And that's the thing, it believes, you know, we could have an interaction with someone. There's a thought experiment I often use, I think I've used it before here, but imagine 3 people and they meet each other on a train station. And at the beginning, the first person has had a bad day. They've woken up on the wrong side of bed, so to speak, and they're grumpy at the other people, right? A couple of months later, they meet again. Those people are still going to remember that grumpiness. They won't immediately identify it, but they'll feel with themselves, I don't like this person. I don't know why. But then they'll remember, oh yeah, they were mean to me. So it builds up this story. It builds up all of these little building blocks of this fortress, of this sense of self. And that continues on because there's these agendas tied up in it. So it is a very, very big picture, but in the question of it, what is it that gets reborn? It isn't really a thing. It's more a stream of consciousness, a stream of ideas that continues on, a force of energies that has been built up from these desires, these wanting to be, wanting not to be, and this desire for basically happiness and sense pleasures, which is all the stuff contained in the second noble truth. Those are the things that drive us on. So it's a very big question, but it's a difficult one when we relate to it in terms of me or other people. Who is it that is reborn? Because it becomes more a question of, let's imagine heavy rain on the side of a hill, and it washes a rock into the river. It really has the same meaning as who is the rain, who is the rock, and who is the river. They don't really apply in the Buddhist sense. It's just cause and effect. So it's not easy to give a short answer to that because it's a very, very big question. But I hope this helps a little. Yeah.
Well, that does sound good. And Nikki, would you like to unmute and ask your question now?
Hi, Venerable. That was a really nice meditation, and that was a really good talk. I wrote down some notes actually, and the bit that I wanted to ask you actually is when I wrote this down, I don't know if you said it word to word like this, was it's not what I have, it's what I do with what I have, as such, kind of like that. And so recently, because I got diagnosed with cancer recently, and then what I noticed was that before the diagnosis, my life was about how well I lived it in such a living my best life. That was kind of the thing that you get here. Mm-hmm. So I always felt like I was missing out because I didn't think I was living my best life ever. And then I got the diagnosis, and then I got really, what now is, how do I die well? I asked Ajahn Brahmali this, went to see him in person. And his answer was to live well. It was as simple as that, and it was so great. And so then it leads into what you're saying, is like, it's really changed my perspective on, because I don't actually want to do much. And people around me, you get things like bucket lists. People say, do your bucket list, you're not going to live long. And that's the last thing I want to do, is I want to lose more things rather than gain. Mm-hmm. Can you find a question in that? There is a question in that somewhere, but I can't gather it into words. What am I asking you? Suppose I'm asking you, is it okay to not want to do much? And just meditate. I just want to meditate, listen to Dhamma and chanting and things like that. And that's really all I want to do.
Mm-hmm. No, that's perfectly fine. There is a stage in our life when we realise that all this bucket list stuff, all this need to have this and have that and everything else, to achieve this and have all these things that we're supposed to eat this and experience this and listen to this and taste, hear all these experiences, ultimately don't really do that much for us. We experience them, yeah, that was nice, and now what? We're back in the same situation. There does get to a point in our lives, not only as we age, but especially when we get closer to death, when we realise we were running around after what? All this stuff we were doing was so unimportant. We were kidding ourselves that we needed to do this and we should have done that, when realistically the mind was saying all along, the body was sort of saying all along, let's slow this down. Let's rest for a bit. Let's be more present. And we do this through the meditation. We do this through living and everything else. And it's perfectly all right. The problem is, it's going completely in the opposite direction of what the advertisers want us to believe. They're telling us, buy this, have this, experience this. And deep inside, we sort of say, no, actually, I want to live a simpler life. I don't need all this stuff. And that's the thing, because ultimately there's no separation, because there's no real self in here to accomplish anything. All of a sudden, there's no need to do it. And when we look at it going, how have we lived in a sense? What are the good qualities we've developed? There's very little of us to be afraid. We don't have to be afraid that we've lost anything, because the fear of this loss is this fear of what we haven't accomplished according to society's agenda, right? So we haven't had a holiday in, this 5-star resort or anything else. We feel that I'm missing out. When all of a sudden we see, actually, so what? We didn't miss out on anything. Even if we had the experience, we'd still be in the same situation. Doesn't matter. It's all impermanent. And so there's this sort of collecting as we get closer towards the end of life, that it all gathers together anyway. And we get a sense of clarity automatically, what we need to be doing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Ben.
You're welcome.
All right, is there anyone else who might like to unmute and ask a question?
Can I ask one?
Of course.
So I would like to ask is I think I always feel like I'm not really important to other people. Like I'm sort of easily replaceable, and I don't feel like I'm important as well. But I feel like that is kind of sort of weirdly, it's kind of sort of aligned with the idea of non-self. Like I don't think Buddha will feel like he's important to other people, but I feel like he probably will not feel like he's not important to other people as well. But I do feel like my way of contextualizing this thing is kind of maybe not really aligned with the right view that much.
Mm-hmm.
But because my brain sorted out, I feel like it kind of logically makes sense. According if everything's calmer and the universe is so broad, and then why would anyone matter to anyone at all? And what I want to ask is cultivating the sort of importance of self, or cultivating the sense of I'm important to other people, sort of beneficial to the practice, or is counterproductive to the practice, and it's go against the principle of non-self. Yes, that's what I want to ask.
No problem. The thing is, we are already contextualizing things in terms of self, me, other. That's the way we've been brought up to live. That's how we automatically contextualize and relate to the world. Me, other. Us, them. Right? So when the Buddha talks about these things called the three conceits, and this is something that we don't talk a lot about in public, because one of them upsets people a lot. And the three conceits is the superiority conceit, as in, the ego trip. I'm special, so to speak. The second one is the inferiority, that I'm not important, because that's still an ego position. Me, I am this. The third one is the equality conceit, as in we're all equal. That one upsets a lot of people in today's age, but it's another story. So the thing is, in this sense, that we're sort of saying, I don't feel important in relation to something else. That's still a self-position. That's still implying an Atman in that, a self or soul, a someone. When we see beyond that, in terms of right view, we can see that's still not quite it. It's still a story, because we're basing it in that relationship. But when that relationship starts to dissolve because it's everything, then all of a sudden there's no important or unimportant. There's no equal. It's all okay in that sense. So the fact is, because we're still operating in the sense of self and other, it's the only way that we can relate to the world until we've experienced that calmness when the self, the ego, completely disappears. And then it's no longer an issue. So it's not so much of a problem, it's more that we can actually change between these three, because they're all different stories, they're all ways of contextualizing. And ultimately we have to let all of them go, because they are still stories. The thing is, we're trying to, get a sense of control in life, which is completely understandable, because everything is impermanent and changing and chaotic and difficult and so on and so on and so on. So it's a perfectly natural response, but the moment we believe it, all of a sudden we're sort of trapped in that story. And that drives us to do all kinds of good things as well as not very good things. That sort of makes sense?
Yes, how to not believe it.
Yeah. Well, it's in sort of the easy way of putting it is that this is the letting go part. But the letting go is based on the wisdom and the compassion. The wisdom of seeing how there's no separation between us and the rest of the universe, but also the compassion to see that trying to contextualize it in terms of self and other will never solve the problem, will never make us happy, will never make us last, will never give us fulfillment and enlightenment and everything else. It's a compassion to see that it is the cause of suffering. And when we let that go, we can see, thank goodness, we're free of that. It's seeing how it's a trap. That's the thing. But we can only make that paradigm shift when we kind of have experimented to see the different ways that we can live, the more happier side, and we can choose to go that way rather than this way. That we don't have to be trapped by these old habitual ways of thinking. We can try different things. It sounds a bit, basic to say it, oversimplifying, but it's a lot like food. We're used to this cuisine that we've been brought up with, and so the idea of trying a different cuisine, at the beginning we're not sure about this, I don't know if I like this, but you try a different cuisine and all of a sudden you go, oh, actually this is quite nice, I quite like this, right? And then you can enjoy it more, and you can experience other cuisines, so to speak, and that gives you a context where you can see, I don't need to be trapped in this old way of doing things. I can let that go. And we keep on doing that until we realize, actually, we don't need to hold on to anything. We can be free. So I hope that helps.
Okay. I think I can try a different cuisine.
We have a message, question in the chat. Would you like me to read it for you?
Yes, ma'am.
In the sutta where the Buddha goes to visit 3 monks at the bamboo grove, the park keeper warns the Buddha about 3 gentlemen whose nature is to desire the self. Was the park keeper actually referring to the monks' practice of trying to understand non-self?
I'm not quite sure of that translation, because the way that I remember this one is a park keeper says that these 3 monks are looking for the good, as in they're looking for the goal of the holy life. And as they turned out to be the Buddhist students anyway, it kind of resolves itself. But in that particular sense, the good, as far as those 3 monks were concerned, because they're already students of the Buddha, they were already looking for that solution. But in this particular case, those monks, Nandya, Kimbala and Anuruddha, they were actually already, I think by that point they were all enlightened. They were all arahats by that point. So the park keeper basically was displaying that he didn't know what was going on. So this monk came in, he didn't know that was their teacher. So he sort of said, these monks are, practicing well, please don't disturb them. And that's basically the context that was set in for that little story. Because when the Buddha enters the park and he's recognized by the 3 monks, all of a sudden they rush forward to welcome him and ask him for a talk and everything else. So in that sense, they weren't really looking for the self because they had already seen through it.
Well, Venerable, we've reached the magic time. Would you like to offer a blessing or words of wisdom to finish the evening?
Yeah. A blessing it is. Why not?
Okay.
Nati me saranang anyang buddho me saranang warang ete na satra waje na sotite hotu sabbada. Nati me saranang anyang dhammo me saranang warang ete na satra waje na sotite hotu sabbada. Nati me saranang anyang sangho me saranang warang ete na satra waje na sotite hotu sabbada.